they're talking about 1.5, 2, in excess of 2 million barrels per day capacity, like, spare capacity. They can really fill the role as a world swing producer. For instance, look when Libya is not the biggest oil producer in the world, but when they stop producing, remember I talked about in the previous slide, it was 8.4 2010. This year so far has been 9.11. Still, if you have 2 million barrels per day capacities or spare capacity, that's enough. And of course, if their number 12.5 is correct, they have much more than that. Therefore, they have actually started to change their focus. When I say they're changing focus, before I talk about changing a focus, I would like to point out that they do have fields which have been found, not developed, and not developing now, to raise capacity to 15 million barrels per day. That is what is listed in the bottom table of the slide. But the way it looks right now, these fields will not be developed because at one point they were actually talking of raising it all the way to 15. So, see, before I change the subject a little bit here, there's a couple of fields that are worthwhile mentioning when you talk about oil production in Saudi Arabia. First, let's have a look at the map. If you remember the big map I showed you earlier, this is the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. See here, this is Kuwait in the top here. We have what I call the little island state of Bahrain, which is connected to Saudi through a bridge, Qatar, and then the Emirates. This big green area here is what is called the Ghawar field. It is the world's only super field. It is one of the oldest fields in Saudi Arabia. It's still the biggest. It's still the biggest field in the world. It has production capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day, which is roughly 50% of Saudi Arabia. We also have what is called another field, which is interesting, is what is called Safanaya. Here, which is the world's largest offshore field. Its production capacity is approximately 1.2 million barrels per day. Downstream focus. As I said, there is not much focus on developing new fields currently within Aramco, so they're shifting to downstream activities. One of these are, of course, refineries. There are many big refinery projects under construction in Saudi Arabia right now. I have mentioned or I have listed some of them in the table here. The biggest ones. These are often joint ventures. You see the one in Jubail, it's a refinery with Total, a French company, ConocoPhillips, and Yanbu. The opposite partner is always Aramco. In total, this will bring about 1.4 million barrels of refining capacity domestically, another 0.325 internationally within 2015. These refinery projects are some of the biggest refinery projects being developed in the world today. Petrochemicals have become increasingly important for the Saudi economy. Petrochemicals is the biggest diversification project going on currently in Saudi Arabia. I will get back to them in much larger detail in section 4. Interesting to have a look at the Aramco estimated spending breakdown. It's too bad I don't have one that is older, because what is interesting to see is how it has shifted. Oil means developing new fields, basically, has shrunk a lot. Gas has been increasing, refining has been increasing, and petrochemicals have been increasing. Since I do work at the Norwegian embassy, it is interesting to talk about a Norwegian perspective on oil production in Saudi Arabia. Currently, there has not been much Norwegian involvement. First of all, it's not the kind of oil production that requires the skill set of Norwegian oil companies. This is not the North Sea. But there are some possibilities in the future. For instance, if they were to open up or start looking seriously at the Red Sea is much deeper than the Gulf. That could be interesting. Oman is a potential source of deep water oil. BP, British Petroleum, is quite heavily involved in Oman. Unfortunately, the Indian company Reliance had to abandon their project there. They had a license to drill. It was called the Block 18, but it really never materialized. They now pulled out. Those event, originally people had hailed that as a potential start of a offshore gas bonanza for Oman. So far, it has not happened. But like I said, BP is still looking for a project to develop and has not given up. There are there is some Norwegian or there's some Norwegian companies already in the Gulf. I know, for instance, that Seadrill and Odfjell have between them 4 jackups currently operating in the region. Moving on to gas. Until the 80s, gas was not something that was seriously considered in Saudi. As many other places in the world, when everyone found associated fields that would say gas and oil together, basically you burned the gas, or torched it. In in Saudi, they developed something called a master gas system. This was brought online in 1975. What that meant was then they finally had an infrastructure to handle, develop, or process, whatever you want to call it, gas they found. It is one of the largest gas infrastructure projects in the world. In 2010, Saudi Arabia produced roughly 1.8 billions, sorry, million barrels of oil equivalent per day. When you make an equivalent of gas into oil, you look at the energy content and calculate gas as if it was oil. It is to be able to compare it to oil production. You know, that is about the same as saying 10 billion cubic feet per day or 100 billion cubic meters per year. Saudi Arabia is roughly the 10th largest producer of natural gas. In comparison, Norway is number 5 and Qatar is the 11th. There's a difference between Saudi Arabia and Norway and Qatar is that Saudi Arabia uses a lot more of its gas, as in Norway exports most of it directly, and Qatar has a very small population and also exports most of its gas. Traditionally, only associated fields were developed for gas, because basically when they were looking for oil, and if they happened to find gas, they would also develop it. But this has changed a lot. Since 96 until today, gas production has more than doubled, and in 2009, more than 50% of the gas produced came from non-associated fields. That means pure gas fields. Gas production is still increasing. Karan field came online this year with about 0.45 billion cubic feet per day. By 2013, when it becomes fully operational, this should increase to 1.8 billion cubic feet per day. Also, if you look at the slide there, I have a couple of other fields coming online in 2013. Despite this increasing gas production, it's true to say that Saudi Arabia has been a little bit disappointed. Actually, they hope to find more cheap gas. Why do they want this gas? They wanted to replace oil in power production. Saudi Arabia gets most of its electricity from oil, and they also want to use it as cheap feedstock for industry. Basically, Saudi Arabia is having problems keeping up with the growing demand. They do, however, have a large potential for unconventional gas. Problem here is price. Developing costs are too high compared to what the gas is sold for in the country. Also, technology. In the America, when they're developing, for instance, shale gas, they use a lot of what's called hydraulic fracturing, which there's a high demand for water, which is very scarce here in Saudi Arabia. But again, the biggest problem is price. In Saudi Arabia, they would sell gas at 0.75 US dollars per million British terminal units. Just to compare, it's similar to other GCC countries. I included Oman, which sells at 0.77 US dollars. Based on what Aramco is saying, they need around 2 to 5 US dollars which is not too far away from the international price for gas these days, but it's light years away from the price gas is sold domestically here in Saudi Arabia. What I've said about increasing demand for private use and also the industry is not just a Saudi problem. It also goes for Oman, the Emirates, Qatar. The Emirates, by the way, is the fifth largest oil and gas producer, but almost 90% of the resources are in the emirate called Abu Dhabi. That ends this section. I hope you'll follow us into the economic diversification section. Thank you very much.